Hey guys, welcome back to the Frequently Fishing Podcast, and today we're going to be talking about the rods I use and how I use them. And this is talking about power and action and basically how I use them and what I believe they are most effective for. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. So I was trying to record this going through all the technicalities of rod weights, like powers and actions, but I decided, I'm not an expert on this. I've been fishing for 2 years, and this is basically what I believe the action is best for, the way I use it, the way I find it the best, and anything that I find helpful when fishing. Because hopefully the goal of this podcast is to reach out to some of the less experienced anglers out there. And as somebody who hasn't been angling for a very long time, but has been going out and experimenting and using different rods, I want to tell you what I use a rod for and what I find them to be effective for. So let's get right into it. So starting with the lightest action I ever get into, I get into ultralight or light action spinning rods. So I use these kind of rods for crappie fishing or trout fishing in the river. And for these kind of rods, I'm going to be using a smaller jig head, whether it's a ball head jig or even a smaller underspin, and a little tiny paddle tail or a bobby garland. And these rods are really good for working a bait that's light. You can cast it far, you can work it light, you can feel your bait working because of the amount of flex in the rod. It's actually very easy to work it no matter what kind of weight you actually have lure wise. So you're going to be throwing like a 1/32 ounce, like 1/16 ounce. And with these rods, like you're targeting small fish that aren't very heavy. Like I've caught trout on a light rod. I've caught crappie on a light rod. I've even caught panfish on a light rod, and that's basically the kind of species that I've targeted using them, and I would say that's probably the kind of species you want to go after using these light and ultra light rods, and even into the medium rod or medium lights. I've used a light rod in the river, just working a small paddle tail and a small jig head and just jigging it through the river and catch. I've caught smallmouth on it, I've caught brown trout, I've caught rainbow trout. And some of the bigger ones are going to put up a little bit more of a fight, and you're not going to be able to horse them in as much as you could with a heavier rod power. But they tend to have a slower action. It's easier to fill a bite on them, and they're very effective for going out and throwing smaller lures around and trying to target a bite from the smaller fish, or even if you're getting into your finicky fish like finicky bass or finicky pike or any kind of fish you're fishing for. If you're fishing finessey, you want to go with the lighter action, the smaller lure to trigger that bite. You want to show them something different. So if you're going with the small side, you pick a lighter action rod, a lighter power rod and a lighter action rod, and that will give you that ability to throw the smallest lure you can while still getting great casting distance and decent accuracy out of it, and being able to reel them in without much of a struggle. You might have to loosen your drag a little bit if you do hook into a bigger fish with it and actually play the fish out. But these rods are mainly for panfish and any sort of smaller fish you actually get into, such as perch or sunfish, crappie, trout. Now I have a multitude of heavier rods. I have a medium heavy and then I have an extra heavy rod. So my extra heavy rod is my jigging rod, and I also use that rod for my glide bait. So I have a 6-inch trace that I use on it, and these baits are heavier baits, anywhere from an ounce to, I think my 6-inch trace might be a little over an ounce. A half ounce. I think my 6-inch trace might be a little over a half ounce, but I'm using like a half-ounce jig, a half-ounce glide bait, half-ounce chatterbait, half-ounce spinner bait on this, and the extra heavy rod I have is a 7'6" extra heavy, extra fast action. So you're getting that quick snap on your hook set. So the tip is actually going to bend at the tip. It's not going to bend any further down because it's a very stout rod, and it gives you that ability to actually drive the hook home whenever you are using it for a jig or for anything like bottom contact lure, where you are waiting for a fish to pick it up and you're going to set it as hard as you can to make sure that hook is in the fish's lip and pull it up. This kind of rod is also really good for fishing in cover, whether it's wood or grass or anything like that, because it gives you that extra strength to be able to pull up that extra weight. Whether if you're fishing even with a frog, I'd say the extra heavy would be perfect, because a lot of times when you're fishing with a frog, you're throwing it on mats and you're waiting for that fish to come up and eat it off the mat, and they get tangled up in all of that vegetation and you get a lot of extra weight on that rod. So that rod can handle it. It's built to handle the extra weight, and it gives you that ability to horse the fish out and pull it as hard as you can. And as long as you're using the proper line weight, which would probably be, depending on how you're fishing, whether you're using braid, mono, or fluorocarbon, 14 to 20 pound test, you can horse that fish out of just about anything, and it gives you that really, really stout, heavy hook set that you need. I actually just got a medium heavy spinning rod that I haven't used too much, but I've used it for just about everything. So I've used it for whopper ploppers, I've used it for jerk baits and crankbaits, and now this medium heavy rod is a good in between the extra heavy and the light. It gives you that ability to cast, because it's a spinning rod. So if I'm using a jerk bait or a crankbait and it gets into that lighter weight of lure weight, it actually gives you the ability to cast it out. Now sometimes you get into these smaller crankbaits and jerk baits where on a bait caster it's a little bit harder to cast it out, and personally I just prefer using a spinning rod to work a jerk bait and a crankbait, because it's a little easier to twitch, in my opinion. It's easier for me to hold. I don't have the biggest hand, so it is a little hard for me to get a grip on the bait caster. But this kind of rod is really good for having that sweeping hook set on those moving baits. So if you're using a lighter chatterbait or a lighter spinner bait or anything like that, and if you are using a bait cast, I mean, you could use a bait caster on these lures, because you're probably going from like a quarter to a 3/8 ounce lure on it. And with this kind of rod, with the power of this medium heavy, you can sweep the hook set on these fish that are chasing after your lure. So it's not as much of an aggressive hook set as the extra heavy, but it's not as light and noticeable as the ultralight and light rods, where you're waiting to feel your chatterbait stop and you can sweep into that fish and hook up, or you're waiting to feel your spinnerbait stop, or even like I've used a plopper with it and it's worked perfectly fine for that, where you get that casting distance. I can cast it a country mile with this spinning medium heavy rod. It's a 7-foot medium heavy spinning rod, and I can just cast it so far, but I still have the ability to get a 1.5 pound, 2 pound fish on it and pretty much horse it in as much as I can. There's not much playing the fish out still with this medium heavy. You have enough power to pull it out, but it's not as stiff as that extra heavy, where you can pull that out of any sort of cover that you need to without breaking your line. You know what I mean? So those are the kind of rods I use. I don't have that big of a selection of rods. I just use what I have, and I find that the medium heavy with a little bit faster action, but not as fast as possible, gives me that nice flex that I need to work a jerk bait. It has a nice bend to it, and then, like I said, it has that nice flex about halfway down the blank where you know you have a fish biting and you can sweep into that hook set. Whereas with the heavy rod, you're not going to get any bend out of that at all when you have the fish bite. You're just going to have to pay attention to what you're dragging your jig on, or to your bait stopping, moving how it normally moves. And with that, like I said, you're going to set the hook as hard as you possibly can. Drive it through any plastic you can, or even if you don't have plastics, you're just trying to drive that hook home, and you can literally pull a fish through anything with that. And as long as your knot holds up and your line is okay, you're going to pull that fish into the boat. So that was just a little bit on what I use for rods and my honest opinions on what is best for them. So for the ultralight, I'm working a lot of the smaller lures, a lot smaller jig heads, smaller paddle tails, inline spinners. For those medium heavy or medium power rods, I'm using a jerkbait or crankbait where I have that sweeping action that I can just sweep into a fish and I don't have to necessarily drive the hook home as hard as I can. And for that extra heavy and heavy rod, I'm using that to jig, and I'm using that to throw my heavier baits so I can pull in the biggest fish I possibly can, and so I can pull it through the most cover that I possibly can, whether that's a tree or whether that's just grass or vegetation in the actual pond that I'm fishing. So guys, it's a little bit of a shorter one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you have any suggestions on a new episode, just go ahead and leave it in the comments on YouTube. This is also going out to YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anything like that. And if you do enjoy the podcast and want more beginner angler type of fishing content like this, just let me know what you guys want. I am a semi-beginner angler. I have been fishing for around 2 or 3 years, and I do have a little bit of experience. I'm more than willing to learn with you guys, and more than willing to try different stuff out. So if you guys have any suggestions for future topics or anything you want to know, just go ahead and leave a comment in the YouTube comment section. This has been the Frequently Fishing Podcast. I appreciate you guys listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.